Well, it's 7 o'clock, so why don't we get going? I recognize a few of you faces, a whole lot of folks I don't recognize. So my name is Richard Clark. I'm a professor in the Sociology and Criminology department at John Carroll. For you folks who are guests at Carroll, welcome. We're delighted you're here. For you folks who are Carroll students or staff, it's nice to see you guys again. So tonight is a film, as you know, you're here for the film, The Erie Situation. The film producer director is here, and he'll be part of a panel discussion at the end. Dr. Mike Malampy, who's sitting over there, will actually be moderating the panel discussion. Michael is a retired biology professor at Baldwin-Wallace. He has conducted research in Central America. He has taken Baldwin-Wallace students down to Central America to participate. So Carroll is not the only institution that sends students abroad, et cetera, et cetera. Michael is also on the Northeast Ohio chapter of the Ohio Sierra Club, the Sierra Club's executive committee. And so he's been actively involved in the club. I've actually been a Sierra Club member since 1982, a little longer than I care to remember. And I've been in Ohio for about 30 years, and Michael and I have known each other for a chunk of that time. I do political work for the Sierra Club. I'm on the political committee locally. I was chapter political chair and actually on the national political committee for 8 years. So at the end of the movie, Michael will come up, invite the panel, and we'll have a panel discussion. At the end of that, or however they wish to operate, there will be time for questions. We do have one microphone. We can run around and pass it around to folks. And feel free to ask questions. The other thing I want to mention is Margie's sitting over there. We think most of you folks are registered to vote. My guess is if you're willing to show up for this kind of a film, this kind of event, you are registered voters. But if by chance you're not, or if by chance you're a student and haven't registered, you could register in Cleveland, or you could go back to wherever home is and register there as well. But there is voter registration materials outside. And Margie, who wants to watch the movie, which I don't blame her for, has said she will stay a little bit later if anybody needs to do voter registration. So we're assuming, and everybody we've asked has said, yes, of course, I'm registered to vote. So I have not seen this movie either. So I'm looking forward to seeing it. I've heard lots about it. It's supposed to be a wonderful storytelling movie that tells a really passionate story. So I'm looking forward to it. So without further ado, let me see if I can get this up and running. And Matt, can we dim the lights a little bit?
The whole lake is green. As far as the eye can see, the water is green. It's here what I see.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Malampy. As Rich told you, I represent the Northeast Ohio Sierra Club, which is one of the sponsors of tonight's showing of the Erie Situation. To help us delve into the issues raised by the movie, we have a panel of 4 experts with us tonight, 3 of whom were involved in the film. You may recognize them. And one who was not directly involved. I should mention that we invited the Ohio Department of Agriculture and the Farm Bureau to have representatives on our panel, but they declined. So right now, let me introduce our panelists. Let's see. To my immediate left is Dr. Jeff Reuter. He is the former director of the Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Lab at Put-in-Bay. He currently acts as a special advisor to Ohio Sea Grant and continues to participate on regional, national, and international advisory groups concerned with protecting Lake Erie. He is an aquatic biologist and has published over 150 technical reports and journal articles. Next to him is Sandy Bin. She is Executive Director of Lake Erie Waterkeeper, an organization dedicated to maintaining swimmable, fishable water in Lake Erie. And as you saw in the film, she's an effective advocate for the health of Lake Erie. And next to Sandy is David Ruck. He is the director of the Erie Situation. He specializes in documentary films that deal with environmental themes and has worked with a variety of organizations to produce films, including the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and Sea Grant programs at the Universities of Wisconsin and Minnesota. And then at the far end of the table is Seth Hotham. Did I get your name correct there? Hodem? Okay. He is supervisor of environmental assessment for the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District and has contributed to the development of the Lake Erie Quality Index. He has extensive experience monitoring Lake Erie water quality in Northeast Ohio, especially as it relates to discharges from our sewer system. So what I'd like to do to start, I'm going to ask each panelist to respond to a question. Once they have done that briefly, I will open it up to questions from you in the audience. And I would ask you to, when you ask questions, to keep your questions brief and refrain from long comments so that we can maximize the number of questions that we can consider. Okay, to start with, I'm going to ask David Ruck, the director of the film, what motivated you to make this film, and so far do you think that it is having the impact that you hope for?
Well, first off, I want to thank everyone that's put this together for inviting the film out and screening it here tonight, and to all of you for showing up and being here, as well as my fellow panelists. It was a little bassy in here, and I apologize for that. Hope everybody could hear it okay. I had a little trouble myself, but my ears are kind of bad. I know, Billy. Just relax. This is the first time I've brought my dog to a screening. We're just kind of seeing whether that goes well or not. Good girl. So I grew up on Lake Michigan. My first documentary film was about the same chemical company that was responsible for love canals called the Hooker Chemical Company. We had one that was on the lake where I grew up, White Lake, which became a Great Lakes area of concern. And I got the opportunity when I was 21 to make a film about the toxic legacy of that company on White Lake and what it did to the area. But prior to that, I'd kind of thought I was going to go to Hollywood and do Hollywood type storytelling, writing scripts, etc. But in the telling of that story and all of the hours I spent in the library and the archives and meeting all the newspaper reporters and photographers who'd covered the story over many years, I just kind of became infatuated with the research process of diving into actuality, and so that has really evolved into a career of mostly water-related storytelling. As it was mentioned, I used to work for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I got my MFA at American University, and right out of there, they hired me at NOAA to be an underwater cinematographer, storyteller, sending me all over the place. And that was a really special time. I wanted to go out on my own, mainly because I was just kind of married to like one little audience or office inside of a giant organization. I wanted to be able to explore all the many and various ways that they were impacting our daily lives. There's people flying airplanes into a hurricane right now that work for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and I wanted to meet people like that and try and tell their story. So, but I came back to the Great Lakes, and one of the first projects I worked on was looking at the sort of fallout of harmful algal blooms, which is what happens here in Cleveland, which is the hypoxic conditions which affect the water intake here. And after working on that short project, it was the people I met during the making of that we started to talk more seriously about harmful algal blooms, what was causing this hypoxia. And then at that point just started peeling off the layers of the onion. I think at first I thought this was going to be a series of short pieces, probably mostly for Ohio State University, to communicate like the research that was being done to study these things, like the Habs Grab event that's featured in the film. But it just, I got some funding and had the ability and the time and the resources to really spend an entire couple seasons in Ohio, around the Toledo area mainly, to really dig into the details of the story. So that's how the process began, and it was about a 3-year process to finally get to a completed film. Because when you're a documentary filmmaker, you're always trying to scrounge for resources and help and find people that'll work on a project for little or nothing, and here we are.
Okay, next for Sandy Ben. What is necessary to address liquid and solid manure runoff from confined animal feeding operations so that we can avoid further pollution in Lake Erie?
Simply to treat it at the source, and either that or, as Jeff talked about, take it and put it on more acres. There just has to be source reduction. When Lake Erie's problem was solved before, there were 2 components that drove it pretty much, and that was taking phosphorus out of laundry detergent, which there were, actually started in Akron, Ohio, where resolutions were passed, and then 28 states ultimately passed bans on phosphorus in laundry detergent. So Procter & Gamble didn't stop using it until there was a lot of pressure to do it. And then the wastewater plants also reduced the amount of phosphorus that was coming out into Lake Erie, and voila, we had a good Lake Erie. In every situation that I look at in terms of how a water body comes back, you have to reduce sources or take out the crap that you put in it that's causing the problem today. The answer today is very simple. Simply reduce the amount of manure coming into the system and we'll see results. It's not complicated. I live next to Mommy Bay State Park. I saw this when it started. We built our home in '87. I see the lake every day. All of a sudden in the mid-90s, the algae came. And when the Kfos came and the manure was applied, that's when this problem started.
Okay, next question. This is for Dr. Reuter. This year's algal bloom is below average. So is that a sign that we are making progress with the lake?
That's a great question, Mike, and there are a lot of people that are misinterpreting this because we've had 3 years in a row of below average precipitation. I was the chair of a team of 25 binational U.S.-Canadian scientists that put together our targets. 40% reduction would deal with the harmful algal bloom, but reduce the amount of phosphorus coming into the Western Basin during the spring by 40%. That would eliminate our harmful algal blooms, or essentially we would have blooms that looked like 2012, very small bloom, or smaller than that, 9 years out of 10. That was our goal. We decided that to measure our progress, and this is really important because this is where people are missing it right now. To measure our progress, we needed to look at the flow-weighted mean concentration of phosphorus. And an easy way to think about that, think about it as the average amount of phosphorus coming off of a farm field. That's maybe an easy way to think about this. And we needed to bring that average amount of phosphorus down. And we said that if you can't measure a 40% reduction in that average amount of phosphorus, you're not going to be measuring any improvement out in the lake. So the way to track our progress is look at the flow-weighted mean concentration. Is it coming down? If it's not, we're not making any progress. We made our recommendation in 2015. The US and Canada approved that recommendation in 2016. We have seen zero progress. Zero progress. The flow-weighted mean concentration has not come down. You can't look at the load, because if it's primarily agricultural runoff that is causing this, if you have a dry year, a drought year like we've had for the last 3, you're simply going to get a smaller load, and you will have a smaller bloom. And if you have a really wet year like we had in 2019, even though we could have been doing all the right things, we could have reduced the concentration. We didn't, but we could have reduced the concentration. And because we had so much rain, we would have had a large load. So the bottom line is this average or below average bloom for the last 3 years is simply because we've had 3 drought years or 3 low rainfall springs in a row, and it's the first time since 2007.
Okay, final question for Seth Hotham. Based on your, in your work for the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, have you seen any trends in the presence of toxic algae in Lake Erie waters adjacent to Cleveland? And can sewage discharges into the lake contribute significantly to toxic algae blooms?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really seen any significant trends. Our blooms are kind of hit or miss depending on the year. So we had a small one this year. It wasn't toxic. We didn't have any the last couple of years. 2015, the big one came over from the Western Basin. It stuck around for about 3.5 weeks over here. But once again, there was like one sample at each of our beaches that was above the advisory level. So it's different over here. I guess it's better in some ways, but obviously there's still blooms, so that's a problem. In terms of sewage, can it cause problems? In the past, it was a lot worse. So back in the probably late 70s, early 80s, I think sewage contributed about 33%, I think, of the total phosphorus going to the lake. Now it's down to 14%. So obviously that's an improvement, and I would say it's not that significant compared to agricultural waste.
Okay, thank you. I want to open it up to the audience now. And if you'll raise your hand, we'll come around with a microphone, or somebody will. Rich will. And you can state your question, and then one of the panelists, you can direct it to a particular panelist, or you can direct it to the entire panel, and they can decide how they want to respond to it. So take it away.
Nice reading.
Thank you. I'm thinking about the chart that showed all of the, I don't know, what are the phrase for all the meat production? Anyways, in the chart there were big circles and little circles, and my question has to do with how much of that production is smaller farms, family farms, and how much of it is corporate. And yeah, and we didn't really see much about the corporate.
So in terms of you're talking about the map? Yeah. Okay, so that map has been expanded since we made this film to cover how much again? From like South Bend, the entire watershed. I don't know that anyone has determined who owns what, per se. I think that there's probably a number of farms out there on that map that, like the big blue circle, we know is the giant chicken Kfos that's in Defiance County. But in terms of like ownership, that's not really what the role of the map was. It was really looking at the design of the structures based off satellite information and deciding like, okay, that's a cow farm, or that's a pig Kfos, that's a cow Kfos.
Actually, what they did was they took satellite imagery. They're all concentrated animal feeding operations. They're not the family farm that pastures, okay, because they don't have the same kinds of barns. So all of those, big dots, little dots, are all concentrated animal feeding operations, and they all are a part. And I mean, maybe there's one or two, but from my knowledge, none that are part of the big ag issue, factory farms and whatever. That's just the way, when you see those barns and the design of those barns that are designed by big ag for specifically a farmer who contracts for that, what happens with that farmer is the animals are supplied by big ag. The food is supplied by big ag. The building and its design and everything is big ag. The only thing that farmer is responsible for is, anybody guess?
Waste.
Manure. So the only part they leave to the farmer is how they manage the manure. So those of us that are trying to get that manure managed get the pushback that it's the farmer we're trying to hurt. Well, we're not trying to hurt a farmer. That's not it. But they're very clever in how they design the system and play the system. And that's not just true here in the Lake Erie watershed. This is true nationwide. So it's the manure that is the issue for the water. There's a lot of other things about Kfos that people will talk to you about in terms of it's not organic, obviously, it's mass production, right? And there's a lot of issues, animal rights and all kinds of things. But for water, it's about manure. And it's that farmer that has the responsibility for that manure. So in pushing it, then the economics become into play. But there's contracts that those farmers, and I've talked to the farmers, that they have with the integrator and with Smithfield in particular in this region. In Coldwater, Michigan, about 7 or 8 years ago, they located a processing plant that's in southern Michigan toward the Ohio side. That processing plant, when it was built, was said to have 100 more Kfos, hog Kfos, in the western Lake Erie watershed. We've gotten more than 100 folks. So this is massive animal production. It's not big dots, small dots. You may not want a permit or get a permit. I don't care which one it is because the manure is being overapplied either way. And it's just a problem.
Is that map public? And if so, where do we find it?
You want to go to the Environmental Working Group, EWG, and they've done this not just in this region, but they've done this at other regions around the country as well. And they're very one of their big focus areas is sort of looking at ag's impact on the watershed in a very detailed way.
There was just a study that came out by the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and it showed between 2012 and 16, I think is what it was, that the amount of phosphorus here is going up. And that report specifically says it's attributable to livestock and the phosphorus increases in this watershed. Yet we don't see any of the researchers or anybody talking about that piece and the problem with that piece. So it's not just that. There's also, if you're interested in this subject, Circle of Blue just came out with, Keith Snyder came out with a nice piece, and just Google it and look at Lake Erie. And he has an extensive 6-series reports on this issue. It is very difficult for us to get the system, the government, the researchers to look at manure in this whole issue. Very, very difficult. If you look at a study on Lake Erie or you'll hear ag. They don't separate it into commercial fertilizer, where the farmers, the family farmers, have actually been reducing the amount of phosphorus over time, and where the manure has actually been going up and then excessively applied. So if you hear here where you're not going to use phosphorus, and I just heard it today in Niagara Falls at the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement 50th anniversary, we're going to make phosphorus. The head of US EPA, Deborah Shore, had a vial, and she said, there are little beads of phosphorus. And she said, if you put this in, it'll stay in the soil and it won't run off. Well, folks, if we do that, that'll help the family farmer, the row cropper, but then what do you do with the manure?
My name is Dr. Kaplan. I am passionate about lakes, and there are two key factors that are causing the major pollutions. Number one is armoring. We have almost more than 80 to 90% of our shores armored in order to protect losing soil. the legislation encourages us to armor, and that destroys the ecosystem, which absorbs the pollution, the habitats that absorb and mop up the pollution. So unless we go to our elected officials and say to them, you have to stop allowing more armoring, we're not going to have any help. But the biggest problem, and I as a medical doctor am concerned about our health. We all know that we are not designed to eat animals. Go to YouTube and see a video, key the words idea stream, gorillas, Cleveland Zoo. We have 98% the same DNA as gorillas. All the gorillas over 25 years ago in our troop at the zoo had diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and cardiac disease. One of them actually died. And out of exasperation, the doctor in charge of the gorillas, because she never learned this in veterinary school, did not know what to do. Her troop was dying. And so she decided to look and see what happens to these animals in the jungle. In the jungle, they don't eat any processed anything, and they don't eat meat. And out of the blue, she decided to change the diet and give them only what they eat in nature. As soon as that happened, the obesity was gone, the hypertension was gone, the cardiac disease was gone, and diabetes was gone. We have 98% the same exact DNA as gorillas. We have split from them about 6 million years ago, but our organism is still not processing. And unless we understand that we have to change our diet, we are going to suffer. We have the cancers, we have all these awful diseases. The number one expense in the United States is not military, it's only 20%, is healthcare, and everybody's in it. Nobody cares. Nobody tells you, you got to stop eating animal products. You'll never have to worry about Kfos if you don't have all this meat. So I hope that you will think about it, and I would like to have some feedback from the panel. Thank you.
A couple quick bits of feedback. As armoring is critically important along the shoreline, some of the fisheries issues that we have right now are because it's no longer possible for our lake species to get in and use some of the coastal wetlands because we've armored them. But the armoring of the shoreline has nothing at all to do with harmful algal blooms here. Over 85% of the phosphorus that is causing the harmful algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie is coming in from agricultural runoff on the Maumee River. And there's nothing that we can do here in Cleveland with our sewage treatment plants that will have anything at all to do with western basin harmful algal blooms. We can do things that would address dead zone issues. There's a lot that could be done on reducing our demand for meat and pork. That would have huge benefits. And there are a number of student groups at OSU, and I think probably every university, that are thinking exactly that way, that when we look toward the future, we should be thinking about eating a lot less meat. And when you do feel a heck of a lot better. It's from a health standpoint, but it's also much better for our agricultural system. But even now, 80% of the corn that we produce in Ohio does not go for human food. It's 40% goes for animal food and 40% goes for ethanol production. Watch. Take it.
I understand the need to focus on manure as the cause, the direct cause of the algal blooms, but clearly the manure is there because of the animals that are, in the Kfos, and there is just far too many animals in that whole western area of Ohio for the land to support. So I have two questions. One is, what is being done to get rid of the Kfos? Because it's, not meat that's good for anybody. because of how the cows are being raised. And that was so one is what is being done to get rid of them. And the second question is, it seems to me like whenever you hear about Kfos, it's always Western Ohio, not Eastern Ohio. And why is that?
First, there's really nothing that's being done to get rid of the Kfos. In fact, there are more coming every year, and that's a major concern for me. I'll give you two reasons for that. Just as a rough back-of-the-envelope kind of a calculation, to get a maximum production crop of corn, you would want to have about 50 parts per million phosphorus on your field. We'd like to get everyone applying at that rate. The animal operations are allowed to apply at about 4 times that rate. So they're putting on more than 4 times the amount that is needed for maximum crop production. Big part of the problem right there. And every year we see more Kfos coming in. We see, as a result, we see a buildup in the soil test phosphorus, the amount of phosphorus that's in the fields out in northwest Ohio, anywhere the manure is being spread. It's not unusual now to find fields that have over 1,000 parts per million. I know of one field that has over 2,000 parts per million. The amount of phosphorus that comes out off that field or off any field during a rain event is determined by how much phosphorus is in that soil. When the fields are down at about the 50 part per million, which results in maximum crop production, when they're down at that level, the amount of phosphorus coming off the fields hits our targets. If we could get everyone to simply stay at the amount needed for maximum crop production, we would achieve our targets. But they're up at the 20,000. And then the last number that I want to give you, this one is just so frustrating for me. We also know that when a field gets well above that target level, and you continue to, even if you don't apply any more phosphorus to it, it goes down somewhere between 1 and 5 parts per million per year. So if you have a field that has 1,000, think how many years it is going to take that field to get back down to where you're going to need phosphorus again.
And the answer to your question in part is the Cuyahoga watershed is mainly preserves. You don't have an agricultural watershed. In Western Lake Erie, we do. And so it's agriculture to start with. That's why the Kfos go there. Secondly, I'd like to say that in China, they require that manure be treated for E. coli, and they limit the number of animals in a watershed. We actually have pictures of facilities there where they require treatment of it. Smithfield was bought out by China, and the government of China helped to buy them out. And the reason, and Reuters writes, that it's about 50% cheaper to have an animal go to production in the U.S. than it is in China. And the reason for that, of course, is the grain and the food for the animals is cheaper here. But the second reason is that environmental laws here are so much weaker. And that's disgusting, folks. If China does it better than we do, and they're here to take advantage. And by the way, for those of you that want to reduce meat, 30% of the production right now of meat and dairy is exported. So it's a money problem, it's an it's a big business problem. And we need in America to do what China does and other countries are doing in terms of controlling the numbers of animals in a watershed and treating the manure.
Hi. So I've seen some research that focuses on corn and soy agriculture as a source of phosphorus runoff, and the fact that modern fertilizers contain more readily soluble phosphorus than fertilizers that were used in past decades. So has there been much research on the breakdown between livestock and crop agriculture as far as what's contributing the most to the phosphorus loading?
It's a great question. A couple key points. When they are applied at the at equal amounts, there's no difference between commercial fertilizer and manure, meaning that there's nothing inherently wrong with manure. And you're absolutely right. The commercial fertilizers that we're applying now are much more soluble than the commercial fertilizers that we applied in the 1970s or the 1980s. And the problem is being driven by dissolved phosphorus, or the soluble portion of the phosphorus. And the commercial fertilizer is much more soluble than it was back in the 1970s or the 80s. And that is indeed part of the problem. But again, with today's commercial fertilizer, and when it is applied at no more than the amount needed for maximum crop production, the amount coming off the field hits our targets. We're at the target concentrations.
And the only thing I'd add to that is that Pat Glibbert, if you take down the name, University of Maryland, or you email me, there's a report on that across the country as to how much commercial fertilizer is being used in the practices and manure. And Dr. Roy, I mean, that's what she says, and that's correct. The other thing that we're seeing, though, is actually he quoted 50. The farmer friends I have now are at 20 parts per million, and I know of a lot of farmers that are using soil management to get it down to 0. And so if they don't, because the difference between manure and commercial fertilizer from an economic standpoint is one you buy and one is a waste. And there's a night and day difference between the incentives, right? You don't want to use any more fertilizer than you have to because it costs you. So, they are using less and less, which is good, and the manure is applying the same or more, which is bad, and that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the problem's at.
I have a bit of a less technical question that might be good to end on. I see Michael getting a little antsy back there. My question is for David. Having spent time with all of these groups that are somewhat involved in this issue in one aspect or another, I've been in a number of those public hearings that can get a little tension-filled, so I'm very familiar what those kind of scenes look like. And I'm wondering if, having spent time in all of those different groups with all of those different individuals, if you kind of saw a path forward together, or maybe some doorways that could be opened that, could lead us to a collective, way forward through this problem.
I mean, at a basic level, the accurate information, like this film, simply needs to be seen by elected officials. It needs to be seen by decision makers. It needs to be seen by resource managers, people that hold the purse strings. And folks need to become acquainted with the facts. In terms of a way forward, I think that's what everyone is hoping for, is that our elected officials have the cojones to do the right thing. And as the mayor, eloquently points out, at least in the state of Ohio, you've got, your map is so gerrymandered you can't get a damn thing done in this state. So, that's one issue, is the issue of the state of Ohio. But then, as Sandy had pointed out to me during the making of this, these are national issues, though. If you start passing laws that regulate farmers or the way farming is done or agriculture is done in the state of Ohio, there's a good reason no one that lives in this state that's an elected person would ever do that, because now you suddenly, put these people out of competition with Indiana or Michigan or anywhere else. So you really need to start having these national standards or global standards. I mean, UN, for how these sorts of things are managed. And really, to me, that starts with how you language and write and orchestrate and administer the Farm Bill. There's a lot of money to be made, mostly by rich, white, already, giant farms, who pay the lobbyists lots of money to ensure that a good chunk of that half a trillion dollars that we spend in the Farm Bill goes towards these useless programs, like Jeff pointed out. Growing corn for animal feed and ethanol. So, what we need to do is overhaul the entire system of how we grow our food. If anyone was listening to NPR today, I'm thrilled that the Biden administration is having this conversation about nutrition and updating labels on food products and things like that. That's at the consumer end of this problem. We're all here talking about like how do we solve it at the farm, but then Farmer Joe points out it's like, we grow what you ask us to grow. So if you go and buy this shit, then we're gonna grow shit. If you go and buy something that's healthy and nutritious for your family that is grown in a healthy, nutritious way, you're going to see more people doing that. I just heard the other day that, because farmers that have been, screaming at the heavens for years about how they want to be more environmentally friendly, these small groups of folks, give us something in the Farm Bill. Well, they're going to be awarded $2.8 billion of the $450 billion. So it's like half of 1% is going to incentivize these sort of new ways of farming, or a lot of times they're old ways of farming. Nutrition in an apple 100 years ago was greater than it is in an apple grown today because of the way it was farmed. So, that $2.8 billion does nothing to incentivize people that are farming in an unsustainable way to change what they're going to do, because they're already making a ton of fucking money off of the federal handouts that are coming their way to grow monoculture crops, corn, soybean, animal feed, and make ethanol and burn diesel fuel to make that ethanol. So it's actually more environmentally sustainable to drill for frickin' oil and extract that and burn that in your Dodge Ram than it is to grow corn for fuel. You want green energy? If you're looking at ethanol versus diesel, you might as well go with the diesel, because we've impacted the environment less in the process of just extracting that, burning it, and driving down the road than we have in the whole process of growing corn to make ethanol. So that should be the goal. Know who you're electing. In Michigan, we have the League of Conservation Voters. I believe there's other similar organizations in your state who kind of create these scorecards for people either in office or running for office, I believe, on where they stand on particular issues. And this is where we need to be. As far as all these groups kind of turn the knobs a little bit one way or another to differentiate themselves on I hate to use the word how extreme they are, but like some people are are zero tolerance, some people are compromise, etc. But ultimately we're not growing food in a sustainable way. Farmers that want to do that have very little incentive to do so, or to help them along the way. We're certainly not incentivizing the farmers that are doing it the wrong way to change their ways in any meaningful way. So that's what's needed. We need Washington to understand that all this obesity and things that you mentioned. I'm hopeful that this conversation that's taking place right now, I'm hoping that turns into something meaningful and some meaningful changes to the Farm Bill. I'm sure that there will be, but I also know that given what we know about how Washington works, it's going to be very incremental. And you need systemic change to do away with the kinds of problems that we're seeing in Lake Erie on an annual basis.
Time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Terry Murphy. I am fascinated. That was a tremendous film. There were so many different pieces of it I find thought-provoking. What my question revolves around the sort of the grassroots politics, those scenes where you had the gatherings of the farmers. I couldn't help but, man, I just wish I could hear where they're coming from. I wondered, and I'm thinking about, I was reminded of the senator, I think he's from Montana, John Tester, who was railing about big farm, Kfos, and the disadvantage. He's a farmer, and the disadvantage to the smaller farmers. And I'm thinking about Farmer Joe. He was incredibly compelling. What do you find in those enclaves when you're into the grassroots of the people doing the farming? Your last comment got me thinking, okay, they're sort of strictly needing to and paying attention to the Farm Bill incentives. So that makes sense to me. But I just wonder, again, grassroots politics, how much opportunity is there to develop a following of these smaller, perhaps the organic folks, but even more so the ones in the middle, not the Kfo folks, to sort of rally that group if it's big enough nationwide. Again, another good point. If they're not doing it in Indiana, we can't handicap the farm industry in Ohio exclusively. That doesn't do anybody any good. But is there an opportunity to really rally around the kind of farmers like Joe and the Joe Testers of the world, and have that be the group that's raised up? And I had one other smaller question, which was around the organic label. I am one of those people that go into the store and I wonder, can I really trust that? Is that real? And can I trust what's behind it? And I think if consumers had a better sense that, yeah, that's real in terms of the value of what you're getting versus the rest of the produce.
I'll take the first piece of it. You can do the organic, or somebody else can. So on the question of the farmers, the head of our organization is a farmer, a family farmer, and he's a member of the Farm Bureau. And one of a great moment was when I went to a farm meeting where the state of Ohio was doing the beginning of the H2O Ohio program, and they were paying the Kfos to haul the manure to another place and allowing the 150 parts per million. And there were about probably this many people there, 50 people or so, of which 75% were family farmers, row croppers. And they raised up and yelled at the state of Ohio and said, it's wrong for you to pay that guy to haul that manure and allow 150 parts per million. Get it down to 50, that it's our level or something less, but you're wrong to do it. And do you know what they won? And you reminded me of, they actually won that war, because right today, when you get H2 Ohio money, it's 50 parts or less. Now, how they test it and whether it's reliable, that's a whole other issue. But at least they won. And most of the farmers, they're not all organic, and they're not all what you'd like them to be, probably, in terms of their practices. But the row croppers understand and are afraid in many ways, to be honest. I mean, what happened to the livestock industry? We had this conversation at supper tonight, where livestock, 80% of the people that raise the livestock are out of business today. Because when the Kfos came in and Big Ag came in, they deliberately underpriced meat and dairy to drive the small farmer out of business. That actually happened. It's documented. It's there. The same thing, folks, is happening with, GMO seeding. There's just a whole lot of things going on. So there is a huge farm community. Farmers Union, actually, in the country, in Ohio, is really good. And they take on these issues, but you reinforce something, and it's just hard to organize them. And no farmer wants to go against another farmer. That's another kind of a code of, respect for each other. So it's but there's far few Kfo farmers than there are regular farmers. And just to try and help that, that's something that we all should pursue. I'll let him answer the organic. Do you want to take the other part, Jeff? Anything else? Okay.
I do know that the organic little sticker thing is sort of this coveted, you got to dot all these I's, cross all these T's. You know, if your neighbor's spraying and some of it lands on your property, then you get screwed. And you know, so there can be issues with that too. But and I guess not all organic is the same, in the sense that it's not all grown necessarily in a way that we might be thrilled about. But it depends on the crop, and it basically depends on the crop. It depends on what we're talking about. But there's a bigger movement, I think, amongst younger farmers to grow with organic methods. They don't necessarily get the stamp, but there's this holistic approach. Really, what I'm interested in when I talk to folks that are farming are the people that don't just talk about organic, but they talk about soil health. And, you know, that's kind of another layer. And Joe's one of these guys that he's not just an organic farmer and adhering to the guidelines of what it means to be organic, but he's very concerned about how the soil, what constitutes that soil. So I think that these are the kind of conversations that you want to be having one-on-one with your producer, if you can. And this is where I always inject that if you know where a farmer's market is, you know, this is where you can develop a relationship with a producer or producers, and you can have one-on-one conversations with them about, you know, how'd you grow your kale? Or, you know, how'd you grow these carrots? You know, tell me about this beef that you have in the freezer. And, you know, it's at those sorts of places where you're really interacting with someone who's probably regional, if not local. And, you know, you can interact with them directly. Something else I thought of that is sort of a tangent and aside, but it's another story I'm working on for PBS, Detroit Public Television right now. It actually started as another story that another producer was working on, but we were up in Traverse City, and this outfit had gotten a grant to start trying to buy farmland from aging farmers who are just being, you know, priced out from there. It's development. It's not that, you know, a huge corporate farm is going to come in and take over, but that it's happening. Yeah, that we want to put a condo there, or you know, harden the landscape or something like that. And these farmers that have had these farms for generations, a lot of them, you know, that's the last thing they want. And some of them are willing to take a little less money if it means that land's going to stay as farmland. But in the process of making this, and they are using organic methods with their training that they get for these sort of incubator program that they have for young farmers to then like lease pieces of this land so that it keeps staying in farming. But one of the things that I heard while I was working on that I was like, no, here's another story, was one of these young groups of farmers had they partnered with a distillery, actually, and they were producing a kind of rye that had nearly gone extinct. And it turns out that they're growing this rye on South Manitou Island, which is controlled by the National Park Service. And a light bulb went off in my head. And I'm thinking, wait a second. The Park Service, we think of like all the land that they have, and, you know, historic lands, like think of Gettysburg. I mean, Gettysburg is farmland. They are now growing an historic crop, the same crop that was grown on this historic farm that is a feature when you walk around on South Manitou Island. This young farmer is now reusing that farm in the cooperation with Michigan State, who've located the seeds, and the National Park Service, and they're growing something and they're making a buck off of it and partnering with this distillery. And it got me thinking, boy, can we expand this program, even if it's just a demonstration program of, you know, these heirloom sort of, you know, agricultural products that were once out there that, you know, now it's like you got a red apple and a green apple, you know. You got the red tomato and the red tomato. Can we talk about that? Can we ask more questions about that? Like, hey, Department of Interior, let's look at the map and see where historic farms existed on lands that you control, and can we find somebody who's willing to partner with you and get you growing, some historic crop? Because the USDA has a seed bank, I think, out in Utah where stuff that maybe isn't even growing anywhere anymore, but they have seeds for it. Like, let's try that. And then let's bring people there. So when you go through the national park, you're like seeing these crops get grown. Suddenly, we're going to want to see those things in the store, I think. Maybe this is just a tiny little piece of solving our puzzle, because we eat what we're told to eat, which is freaking corn syrup right now, right? Anyway, I could totally go off on that and talk about this all night, but very exciting.
There's a consumer angle there, right, and a whole commercial appeal to that ancient grain growth.
Just thinking like micro, they went from nothing to they're everywhere. I mean, we can do the same thing.
I don't want to let Seth Hodham off the hook here, and I have one last quick question for him. The film focused on what's going on in the western end of Lake Erie, and I was wondering, do you know if we around the Cleveland area have a monitoring system similar to what they have in Toledo to detect toxins from say algal blooms in the event that they were to get over this far before they would enter our water system?
Yeah, I know they do monitoring right by the crib. So they're doing monitoring right by the crib. I think they do, daily samples, make sure. We do monitoring at the beach every day. Actually, one of my interns is up there. Hi, Tyler. So we look for blooms. We look for algae every day, and if we see something that looks off, we'll go out. We'll collect a sample, and if it's thick enough bloom, then we'll run microcystin and other toxin analysis. So it's more limited than the Western Basin because we don't need as much, but we are doing stuff over here.
Well, it's well after 9.
Other thing to add to that. Can I add to that?
Please,
just
please,
quick.
Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, you have one of your intakes that is now a problem, and are they building another one, or they're doing something for that intake because of the algae problem. So you're going to have on your water bills an increase, or at least a cost that you wouldn't have otherwise had if we didn't have the algae coming. Because what happens in the Western Basin is because it turns over so much and has a lot of oxygen, by the time it gets to this basin, we have the dead zones, and the dead zones are what causes your intake problems. And Jeff knows a lot about that.
Well, you're very fortunate in the Cleveland area compared to Toledo. Toledo has one intake. You have 4. And if you have one that creates a problem, you can rely on the other 3. And Toledo doesn't have that option. They have one. If they have a problem, that's it. So you're much better off at this end, aside from being Central Basin, deeper, colder, different forms of algae, and the harmful algal blooms that you have are much smaller, less toxic. But Toledo doesn't have the dead zone. You guys have the dead zone. So
Stirs up the stuff in the bottom.
So it's well after 9 o'clock. I'd like to thank you folks for coming and for asking your great questions. I'd like to thank Mike Malampy and the Ohio Sierra Club for organizing this whole thing, doing the heavy lifting. And a very special thanks to our panel for a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, folks. Appreciate it.